This video is looking at the poem The Emigree by Carol Rumens in depth. It's, I think, a very interesting poem. It can at times feel a little intimidating because, particularly in the final stanza, it goes a little bit abstract. But the basic idea behind it, I think, is quite clear. That somebody who comes from a country or knows or understands a country, even though they don't live there, have their own version of that country in their heads. And the conclusion seems to be, in the end, that that version, that impression, that memory, however you like to look at it, can actually be stronger in ways than the reality. Okay, so what does it help us to know? First of all, emigree rather than emigrant is the feminine version, okay? That means, emigrant means someone who leaves their place of residence or country to live elsewhere, but it makes it quite clear, therefore, emigree being feminine, that this is a female. A tyrant is a ruler who has unlimited power over other people and uses it unfair and cruelly. It literally means rule by force, you know, somebody who rules by force. That comes up in there. Branding, if you don't know, is a practice where hot iron burns a permanent mark onto a living creature. It's often associated with cows or cattle, or in the past with slaves. And it's a common thing for oppressive and tyrannical regimes to ban language of different ethnic groups to try and oppress resistance or push down groups of people. Okay, there's some of the background things. So if we go into what happens here, obviously the key idea behind it is that some tyrannical force in a revolution or a coup has taken over a country that the speaker originally comes from. And apparently they left the country either before the revolution or coup itself, or before the effects of it became absolutely clear. So they've not had to really suffer it. If we take it through section by section, there we go, it begins. She left her home country when she was a child, before or maybe because it descended into war and was taken over by tyrants. When she was a child, that means she doesn't have a proper understanding of the place. That's very important. It's a childlike view. However, she retains her own memory of the place, even though it's childlike. As a beautiful and bright place, it only seems to strengthen as worse things happen in reality to it. Her home language begins to come back to her, even though it's only at a child's level, because she hasn't spoken it since she was a child. She thinks the state's probably banned it by now, but she cannot stop it. And then, very important, that she imagines in the final stanza. You have to be absolutely clear there. The first line of the final stanza says, I have no passport, there's no way back at all. So she doesn't actually go back to the city. It must be an imagination. Now, that helps because what she imagines is her version of the city taken her back to their city as it is today, and then the supporters of the leaders threaten and accuse her, again in her imagination. But the conclusion is that even when things are dark, it just proves there are positive things behind them. That's the impact of that very important final line, I mean. Okay, let's take the title. As said before, the fact it's the feminine version places this as actually a very clearly female experience. How important that is down to your judgment, but it's there. And it bears this question, particularly when it's a move made as a child. Does an emigrant feel like they belong in the society they joined or the one they've left, especially if they have been in the society they joined for a lot longer? So if you were born and belonged originally to a country but left it when you were a child, when you're an adult, do you feel like you belong to that country or the country you've lived in most of your life? Interesting question that it raises for us. Okay, let's start to look through stanza 1. The 3 stanzas are very carefully organised. They deal with different ideas here. This one is very much about introducing the gap between her memory, her impression of the country and the reality of it. With a phrase that makes it sound like she's telling a story, a fairy tale. Was once upon a time, there once was a country. It makes it sound like the country is fictional. And this is, I suppose, the country as it was there that she remembers. Okay? But the reality of it is made clear in a couple of images. First of all, the image of being seen in that November. Now, you think about November, there's a couple of things I'd go with here. Now, firstly, and most importantly, if, as so often we see, you take the year as a kind of metaphor for the life cycle of something, it means that winter is coming. So that November means it's only going to get worse. Winter is coming onto them, the darkness, the cold, nothing growing, that kind of idea. However, it does suggest that the other side of winter is a spring, which is worth thinking about. The cycle continues, new life, new change. And that could also be seen with the idea of it being sick with tyrants, where presenting the tyrants as a sickness is very effective anyway, something that is bringing the country to its knees and putting it down. But, of course, most sicknesses, not all, of course, but most sicknesses, you get better. And so if the country is sick with tyrants, there is a very strong chance it is going to recover. Add that to what we said with the November. So the reality is presented as not permanent. Another poem that's dealing with time a great deal. There's also another potential reference in the November idea there. The Russian Revolution is either known, depending on your calendar, as the October Revolution or the November Revolution. And therefore, there could be a reference to that. Now, the other view, her view, is presented very differently. The bright-filled paperweight, a very complex image that expresses her view. Now, if we pull this apart, there's a number of ways we could think about it. First of all, I'd take the idea of the paperweight. What is a paperweight? Okay, it is functional. It holds things in place. So you could apply that to her view. Her view is holding in place her life, her ideas, her principles, morals, whatever you like. But paperweights are also ornamental. So there's a sense there that it may also lack purpose in a way. Okay? Now, when you add bright to it, it brings in something that's going to carry on through this, that this is kind of like something that is almost childlike in its idealism, the brightness of the thing there. And maybe the filled part of it emphasises the weight that this has. So it's quite an interesting image that you could spend quite a while on, and we're invited to completely compare it, directly compare it with the Sick with Tyrants. The paperweight actually longer lasting, you know? Is it going to hold things down for longer than the tyrants are going to be there? To add to this idea, we get these two references, of course, to sunlight. Sunlight is a dominant thing throughout it. It's used structurally to end every stanza. Sunlight is, of course, natural light and naturally bright. So then at the same time is suggesting something natural about her memory rather than artificial, which the paperweight might be something you take towards that idea. But further than that, she's branded by an impression of sunlight at the end of this. Now, this is something that introduces an interesting idea that we see coming back throughout the first two stanzas. The idea that this memory, this impression, is not a choice. It's not defiance. It is something that is natural. It cannot be helped. If you think about it, she's branded by an impression of sunlight. Branding is done to you by someone else. It's done to you to usually suggest ownership, and it's permanent. So if she is branded by that impression, then we must think about the idea that it is somebody else doing it, the sunlight doing it to her. She is being claimed almost by this impression of sunlight. And as she says before, the worst news she receives will not break my original view. There's no defiance there. It cannot. It's impossible. So we've got that contrast in there, but we've got that sense that this is something natural. And that's something that carries on and develops in this stanza. Let's do 3 lines first of all. Like the previous stanza, it's 8 lines, but unlike the previous stanza, it's not broken into 2 quatrains. This is more like 2 triplets or tercets and a couplet at the end. The first tercet here, again, quite complex in its way. Let's start by thinking about the way she presents the white streets of that city. It must be her city, the city she is branded by. The graceful slopes glow even clearer. So she's presenting an idealistic, over the top in many ways version. I very much doubt the streets of any city are actually properly white and graceful and glow. But that's what can happen in your own idea, your own memory, your own impression of things, and particularly if it's childlike. Now, that's then with the image of time rolling its tanks and the frontiers rising between us. Now, the tanks and the frontiers suggest on the other side the reality, okay, the army, the aggression, the fight. Now, but when you look closely at the detail, it's not the enemy. Time is rolling its tanks and the frontiers are rising between us. Time is rolling its tanks. It's probably a little bit like we find in the Blake poem London, a kind of a mixture in the metaphor of, obviously it's talking about the tanks of the city coming and rolling through those streets, the tanks of the rulers, the ruling force. But at the same time, it's reminding us that time is again bringing change, and maybe reminds us that time will continue to bring change. Where frontiers rise between us, it shows you very clear barrier, but it's risen up. It's not natural. It's risen up between them, and frontiers will go down. And it allows you to think about the ambiguity of that final simile at the end there. Close like waves. What closes like waves? Is this a reference to the frontiers that rise between us? They close like waves. Or is it that as time rolls its tanks and the frontiers rise between us is a kind of a dropped-in clause, and it is the white streets, the graceful slopes glow even clearer and close like waves? Now, whichever way you take it, think what waves do. When they close, they immediately pull back again. They come forward and they move back again. Again. Maybe that's the point. We can see it from both sides. And both sides are like waves. They come and they go. Although maybe the white streets don't have to when it's in your memory. But once again, time and its progressiveness are at the heart. Now, the rest of it moves on to dealing with the language. And she talks about the fact she only has a child's vocabulary, only has obviously the ability to speak at a child's level. And she uses the simile to describe it as a hollow doll, a plaything, and a plaything with nothing inside it or that's easily broken. It's nothing much to it. Although dolls can, of course, be comforting to children, can be favourite toys. It can be imitation of an actual child itself. So, is it suggesting something about her relationship with it? Quite possibly. But when it comes out, we get a much more mature expression of it. Every coloured molecule of it. Now, we're going back to that idea of colour, brightness, whiteness, all that kind of an idea that gives us that almost idealised version, sure. But the idea that every molecule, every tiny piece of this language is full of colour, is defiance, especially in contrast to the language of the final couplet, where she suggests it being banned by the state. Because I suppose it makes the point that a state banning a language is almost ineffectual. It means they can prosecute you for speaking it, but it doesn't actually get banned. You cannot stop it, and particularly when you compare it, the idea that she cannot get it off her tongue and that it tastes of sunlight. The language is presented as something not necessarily functional. It's a hollow doll. That's the point. It's not important, not functional. It's not actually achieving anything. But it is something to celebrate. It is something pure. It tastes on her tongue of sunlight. We have this imagery of the inability to feel differently. The grammar spills. It's accidental. It comes out. It's not meant. And she can't get it off her tongue. So as we move into the third stanza, the final stanza, this is obviously the most complex one, and much more complex for most people here. It's before with a very clear statement, and I think this is there to make the point. I have no passport, there's no way back at all. That's it. I cannot even go to that country if I wanted to. Right? It's not my country literally anymore. But, and this is where we now get between her city and the city of walls as we come in. First of all, her city is introduced almost like a saviour arriving in its own white plane. Again, another unrealistic image, flying in to be with her. It's described almost like her pet or her child combing its hair, loving its shining eyes, something to be looked after. And then using this wonderful simile, this really idea that it's docile as paper. Paper bit, docile, you know, flat and rested and easy to mould, I suppose, and easy to shape and change. Now, how is paper docile? Well, I suppose the fact is a sheet of paper, like with this poem, can then have words on it and can be changed into almost anything. And maybe that's the point. A fictional city like this can become whatever you want it to become. Then we move into these final 5 lines, where we see the contrast between, in her head, remember it's imaginary, between this city that's come to her in her white plane, her city, and the reality that she imagines still, the city of walls. Obviously the city of walls, barriers, like the frontiers before, something that encloses in the contrast of the freedom of her city. It takes her dancing, a sense of freedom and expression. That's what her city brings. On the flip side, is associated with a repetition here of they, faceless, nasty, unimportant people who don't really have any kind of humanity, and the repetition of accusing as well. Worth noticing that amongst the things they do, one of the things they do is accuse her of being dark in their free city. Now, if we stop and think about that, what that's suggesting is something that we know that these kind of places do. They turn what the reality is on you. So they're being dark, their city is not free. So what do? They accuse someone else, the opposition, of being dark and claim their city is free. It's this idea of turning it on their head. It shows an awareness of how these people use intimidation and accusations and whatever to try and suppress anything there. It's incredibly sinister, these lines, until the shadow falling as evidence of sunlight. This idea that there may be darkness. We may represent it as a shadow, often thought of as something quite dark and dangerous. Right? My shadow falls. But it turns that image and flips on his head. A shadow is evidence that there is sunlight. You only get a shadow when there is sunlight. So the darkness is only there because the light is around it. And the shadow will move and the shadow will change. And if you turn around, you're in sunlight. So if we look at the form and layout of the Emigree. Obviously, to begin with, we've already mentioned the layout of the stanzas, that we've got 3 very organised stanzas, 8 lines each. However, whereas the first is really organised, when I say it's 2 very clear quatrains, the basic unit of poetry that, you know, kind of shows really formal organisation generally. Afterwards, it starts to break up a little more. So we get a sense of a less controlled idea. And maybe that's the point. It's breaking out from the controlled version as we go further on. Now, throughout each stanza, we get this contrast drawn up between her memory or view or impression or whatever you like to call it, and the reality. Each one of them is constructed that way. and I'd suggest to you that it invites us to consider which is stronger, to look at the relationship between them, and maybe come to conclusions you wouldn't expect. Now, the final stanza, you might have noticed when we said 3 lines into 8 lines, the final stanza has an extra line. It is an 8-line stanza, but it has an extra line put on the end, a 9th line. And what happens is when we've got that situation, it means, I think, that the extra line assumes a kind of an importance beyond everything else, because if you've got the kind of pattern, the rhythmic pattern of the poem in your head, that line will then stand out a bit more. So the shadow sunlight point, as we're saying, the idea of my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight that we've just been talking about there, appears to be foregrounded as the central message of the poem, even though it's the last bit there. It's the extra line. It's almost like everything is concluded and then that's added on. And the very fact that that line actually also begins in the middle of the previous line creates a sense of interruption. You know, it goes, they mutter death and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. It's almost as though coming towards a fairly normal end, it's added on to say, no, there's hope, there's something more, no matter how shadowy things seem. It's also, we've mentioned it several times before, very important to consider the choice of ending with sunlight at the end of every line suggests the natural light is what dominates everything. But also it's worth noting that the things said about sunlight strengthen. And we talked about how the stanzas break up a little bit more, but alongside that, the idea of sunlight strengthens. Show you what I mean? It begins with an impression of sunlight at the end of the first stanza. It moves to tasting of sunlight at the end of the second stanza. So rather than just a vague impression, it's actually a kind of sensual interaction with sunlight. I can taste it. Obviously still not literal, because you can't actually taste sunlight. But then we finish with evidence of sunlight. Indisputable. Having had an impression of it, having been able to taste it, now we have evidence that there is sunlight. And it is the very darkness of the situation that is evidence of that brightness, that natural light that dominates everything. So let's take to the big ideas then. I'm going to look at 3 big ideas to do with power and conflict here. First of all, the idea of war itself. Now, whether this is the reality of war, the impact of war, whatever. I think it's important to note that there is no shying away from the dangers, and particularly the fear of war and of the impact of war, especially in the final stanza. But it is that point we've made throughout it, that war is seen as transitory. It's made quite clear. War doesn't last. It disappears over time. Okay? It's horrific. It has dreadful effects all the way around, but it will go. And the suggestion is the narrator's memory is as permanent as she is. It lasts with her, and again, cannot be avoided. It is important, though, the second bullet point there, that there is an emphasis of the way that countries are led in this situation. This situation happens so often. It's this pattern of tyrants, the pattern of banning language that we mentioned right back at the beginning to oppress often minorities, the idea of accusations, and often accusations of things that they're actually doing being pushed onto someone else, a typical thing to do there, and intimidation as we see at the end. But those people who are in power, she makes very clear that they're faceless. There's a lot of humanity in her view. We get a real sense of her, and even her as a child, but there's no humanity behind them. We look at the flip side and we look at the idea of memory, and memory does come up in a number of these. Much of mine deals with the power of memory. I know there are places where you could dispute whether it's memory, but even things such as the vocabulary of her language coming back to her could be related to the idea that it's memory that evokes that brings that back. So the point is, as a suggestion, it can actually even overcome reality. But I would say it's worth remembering, this would be an interesting point to consider, possibly at a conclusion if you're discussing it, that this is from afar. It is not somebody in the middle of it. And therefore, compared to some of the others where you're dealing with the horror of war and particularly the power of memory of being there, the positivity here maybe reflects the fact that she's only hearing about it rather than actually dealing with it. Now, it's also worth noting that the memory is unrealistic, as we've said all the way through, and almost idealistic. But that doesn't matter. Okay? It is a childlike idealism, but within the context of the poem, it's not important, because everything can be constant sunlight in memory. Everything can be idealistic. It doesn't have to be reality, and that's partly the power of memory, is that it doesn't have to reflect reality. And I think, you know, we see that in the opposite way in something like Remains. And then finally we have the idea of a poem that deals with emotional impact quite a lot, and the power of emotions. I would describe it as an onslaught of emotions in the poem. It seems to move between emotions all the time. We get fear, we get pride, we get dismay. But what we do notice is whatever the emotion, it resolves into sunlight at the end of every stanza. So it always resolves into a calmer, brighter solution. And then we come back to this idea, this repeated suggestion that this is not a choice. It's an inevitability that we looked at when we're looking at the details there. I think that's a very effective point to make. And I think that the suggestion of that is that the emotional imprint is very, very powerful. Okay? And particularly related to ideas of your identity. What's imprinted on you inside, you cannot just choose to bring out. It's there, and it will stay there. So as I said, a complex poem, but because it's complex, quite good to write about. There's so much you can draw out of it, whether it's those complex images that come up in there, whether it's the complex bigger ideas, the change and the movement through it. I think there's a lot to take from the Emigree.